Hi everyone. You are listening to an episode of the Bur'yan podcast dedicated to decolonial reflection on international law. Our conversation on the topic is available in 2 podcast episodes. The first part was focused on the historical context, and we recommend listening to it first, as it gives detailed and nuanced reflections on both colonial pretext and decolonial struggle in the field. And in this second part of the conversation, we continue with more personal stories connected to our speakers' advocacy, activism, and research experiences in the spheres of human rights and international law. And our speakers are Viliuia Choinova, environmental engineer and Sakha activist from the Republic of Sakha; Suleiman Mamutov, expert at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and legal advisor of Amnesty International, Ukraine; Selbi Durdiyeva, socio-legal researcher with focus on transitional justice and decolonization. My name is Lilia Yuldasheva. I am the editor in Bida Media and the moderator of this episode. In the previous part, Suleiman, Selbi, Viliuia, you gave us such a complex and nuanced context of the history of the contemporary form of international law, how and by whom it formed and how it has been changing since the 1940s till today. And now I want to continue exactly with questions about today's realities. As two of you, Viliuia and Suleiman, represent indigenous struggle of your people, Sakha and Crimean Tatars respectively, in the organizations of international law during the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine and ongoing occupation and colonization of the indigenous lands by Russia, I want to ask you about your experience in that activist and advocacy work.
Yeah, I started advocating, obviously, like many others, since 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. So before that, I guess a lot of the indigenous peoples from the national republics, we didn't really claim being indigenous. We never seen ourselves. I'm not saying that we never seen ourselves. Of course, we know that we're indigenous, but since Russia always has recognized this small number of peoples of the North and Far East and Siberia as indigenous, and they were always going to United Nations, and there was a Raipon. So we always looked at those representatives as indigenous, but we have our national republic, so we're kind of something different. But in 2022, that kind of disappeared because we no longer have basically our government or our parliament who's representing us and advocating for our rights and protecting us. So I guess I came into this international advocacy as an indigenous representative because there was nobody advocating for our rights officially, like institutionally. So we kind of had to step up. And yes, there was also, and I had a talk with the indigenous peoples from South America and United States about why indigenous peoples are seen as relics of the past. Is because indigenous people are still trying to get justice for the past crimes, the genocides, and like this states like Canada, Norway, only just a couple of years ago, I think, recognized that it has been a crime against indigenous people, these boarding schools, etc. And we kind of not seen in the present and obviously there are no talks about the future, like how we preserve indigenous cultures, etc. So yeah, it's very sad. And my own experience of engaging with these international institutions has been kind of difficult because last year I applied to attend expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples in Geneva, and the registration was rejected. So I only been to the United Nations once, which is this summer. So when I went there, indigenous peoples who have been advocating for indigenous people's rights for decades, they're still talking there that we should be represented as indigenous peoples, not as NGOs. We're not organizations. We're like our own nations. So it's even though the indigenous the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was adopted in 2007. I don't think the rights of Indigenous peoples have advanced since that time very much. We still have to fight and we still have to lobby, advocate. But accessing these platforms, it remains to be really difficult. And not to mention, it's very expensive to go there. And when you don't have like state backing, like you're not an organization who's you're not represented by a big organization or states, then you kind of have lesser voice or lesser value. Yeah, Russia is actively using United Nations platforms for their own benefit. So there's Gonga organizations speaking on behalf of indigenous peoples, and they just repeat the state narrative and propaganda. So they're not representing indigenous peoples, even though that they are indigenous, but they're speaking on behalf of the state. So, and that's the weakness of this international institution, especially the United Nations, that it was created to uphold international law, but at the same time, it can be used against, in our case, against the indigenous peoples, and used as a tool to silence us. And like expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous people and permanent forum on indigenous issues was created to give us platform to hear our point of view, I guess, but it's actively being used by the states, and there is no mechanism to kind of filter that, I guess, if you can call that, because I was also invited to a workshop by this representative from the United Nations Institute for Training and Research on Peacemaking and Conflict Prevention. And when I asked them if Alexei Tsikarev, he's a Karelian representative, is going to be there, and the lady was like, yes, of course we're going to invite him. We don't discriminate. And I was like, okay, but they are the aggressors. So yeah, I don't know how to work against that, but of course we'll continue to go to the United Nations and use their platform because it gives us visibility. And of course the United Nations declarations or resolutions are still official documents. So even if the enforcement is not there, it's all we have. So we're going to keep using this tool that is available to us.
In your experience, how was it meeting representatives of indigenous peoples from all over the world? So often we don't know their stories very well, so I imagine that the Forum on Indigenous Issues could be a place to learn about each other, and maybe despite attempts to use it as a tool for propaganda and promoting official narratives, it still can be a place to build real solidarities.
Yes, definitely. Even though I've only been there only once, there were lots of people from Africa and South America and the Pacific coming to talk to me and wanting to know me. And of course, I was wearing my jewelry, and it's very unique. Nobody else had anything similar. So obviously everybody was coming to me and wanting to take pictures, and I was so happy that I was there, and it's really great. And we can definitely find solidarity between indigenous peoples of the world. And since other indigenous peoples obviously have had decades of experience in advocating for indigenous people's rights, I can learn a lot from them as well. And also, since our state, Russia, is not representing us, so it's very important for us, the independent indigenous activists, to be there and to bring our point of view, because otherwise these people and these country delegates, they don't know any other alternative to what Russia is telling them there. And that's why Russia is holding on to these platforms, because that's the only, I guess, probably the only place where they can participate in international and try to influence other international actors there. So,
yeah, thank you so much. And maybe Suleiman, as an expert on permanent forum of indigenous people in UN, you can also add to what Viliuia have said.
First, about the binding force or non-binding force of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's apparent that this declaration was adopted as a General Assembly resolution. It has non-binding force, and it is considered or viewed as a soft source of international law. At the same time, I think its uniqueness and its influence in the way that, for the convention to be adopted and ratified a lot of steps. States should do a lot of steps, make a lot of steps, and it requires some consent or at least agreement within the society that we access this or another international law instrument, because we need to ratify it and we need to incorporate somehow it into the domestic law. We can see that ILO conventions, which are binding, not so many states actually joined these conventions. While the concepts used in the UN Declaration, these concepts are more and more included or incorporated or influence the national legislation around the world. And I think first is because the declaration was designed in a very inclusive way. The number of indigenous peoples delegates was really high when it was discussed. The very fact that it was discussed within or during 25 years, I think, or even a bit more, it's really long, but it was a point of this consensus between indigenous peoples on the one hand and the states, and then the government's position. And of course, the longest discussions were about the formulations that covering the right to self-determination. And every part of this process was seeing the challenges and risks for themselves. I also think that yes, the progress with recognizing indigenous people's rights within the UN is really slow. And we need to remember, I think, that this is an intergovernmental organization created by governments, created by states, not by indigenous peoples. And probably it reflects the pathways and the speed of recognition by the international community, by every state that is the member state of the UN. While I fully agree that the progress is slow, I think we cannot deny that the progress is in place. For example, I think that UN made a long way from a non-recognition. The things that I taught about the UN Universal Declaration, Human Rights Declaration, and that it was predominantly the document that has nothing to do with the decolonization principles and concepts. And today we are discussing within the UN the ways on how to enhance the participation of indigenous peoples at the UN bodies. I also understand that this discussion started, I think, 11 years ago in 2014, and before the 2014 outcome document that was the beginning of these discussions, there were other previous discussions that led to this outcome document in 2014, and that again, in order to make some progress within the enhanced in the area of enhanced participation of indigenous peoples within the UN bodies, it can take 20, 30, 40, 50 years, but the progress is still there. It's really slow, and we can discuss how to make it faster and whether the word speedy can be used. I would refer to the systems theory. I think the bigger the system, the more difficult it is to make any changes within this system. And UN is no exception to this rule. Or when the change is happening, it can take a long way, and we can expect a lot before we see some changes, in real changes in practice. I think I fully agree that indigeneity and the concept of indigenous people's rights. I will always add this word people's. I think it should not be considered as something cultural only, and that political rights, we always must talk about it and underline the importance and significance of this. Even when we talk about very cultural things like language, our traditions, preservation of languages, you always need political tools in order to make a free, prior, and informed consent operating. It is impossible without enhanced political rights for indigenous peoples. I fully agree that unfortunately many states, not many, but some states, and Russia is part of this club of states that use this forus within the UN and these advisory bodies like permanent forum, like expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. Russia and some other countries, by the way, they use this force to underpin its positive image and reputation in the eyes, in the beliefs, I think, of the global majority states or so-called global South states. And they manipulate by investing and supporting these government-controlled NGOs. I would say Gongos, mentioned by Viliuia. This is really the problem that we had, and that I'm not sure there is any way to struggle with these trends other than to still continue trying to be present at this forums and showing alternative position, because otherwise there will be only one position and only one version of what is going on in the countries where we live, or in the territories where we live in. If you listen to the statements of these government-controlled NGOs, it can look like the lives of indigenous peoples, for example, in Russia, it is an ideal life, and that they now already finally reached the communism, and that everything good that can happen to them would be impossible without the role of the government. It's sometimes really unfortunate statements which tell about how Russia, for example, helped preserve the language or culture of the small numbered peoples. I can only agree that this is the trend. But I think even here, I see some progress, because since 2022, it was the first time when Russian government nominated representative was not elected. Instead, I was elected, although I was nominated by the government. But here is an interesting thing, that with the permanent forum, the half of members are nominated by governments and half of members are nominated by indigenous peoples organizations. Even when you are nominated as a indigenous peoples organization, you can be still very influenced or controlled by government. And sometimes those who are state nominated, they are more independent. And I'm not saying that this is something systemic or that there is a dependence or there is a causal link between these. But yeah, I've seen interesting trend that for the first time since 2022, and of course because of the Russia's war of aggression, it was the first case when into the permanent forum, within the permanent forum, there was no government-controlled expert member of the UN Permanent Forum. And this year again, the Economic and Social Council elected representative, like the expert member nominated by the government of Latvia and Ukraine. So they effectively re-elected me as an expert member. And once you become an expert member, irrespective of the fact who nominated you, you should be an independent, which of course is not the case for many expert members, but at least formally, you're independent of your government, of the organizations, even the people that you belong to. You should act like an independent expert, listening to many perspectives. I see some progress, I think, even in the fact that this grip on the UN bodies focusing on indigenous people's rights, the Russia's grip is weakening, I think. While at the same time, I cannot deny that the influence of many states, including Russia, despite the sanctions, despite the restrictive measures, influence is still very high within UN bodies at many levels, including administrative level. What to do with this? I don't know. Again, we need to remember that this is intergovernmental organization. And of course, governments will use their influence, and authoritarian regimes will use their influence more than any other, unfortunately. So, and the last point I probably will tell you is that there is an interesting thing with this trend when authoritarian regimes, they send their government-controlled NGOs to these forums or bodies and the sessions of permanent forum or expert mechanism. It may seem like the life, for example, in Iran or Russia is really reached the highest point and the highest social standards, while in Canada, in the United States, indigenous peoples are on the brink of extinction and that they are close to genocide. I'm not trying to diminish or devalue the statements of indigenous peoples from the North America region, but I was telling many NGOs and indigenous peoples, and even within the this closed meetings of the UN Permanent Forum. I was telling to experts of the UN Permanent Forum that the fact that you hear a lot of criticism towards US or Canada, and you hear nothing about India or Russia. India is nominally democratic, but the fact that you didn't hear anything, that you hear nothing about Russia and the problems in Russia, it doesn't mean that the problems aren't here and that they are non-existent. It is just the reflection of the fact that delegates from this state are either they are either afraid to talk, they are not they are denied from registration through many tools, and Viliuia already mentioned it. The bureaucratic system gives a lot of possibilities to control the participation. This is my personal opinion. And so it is not a reflection of the fact that in this region, indigenous peoples are really on the brink of extinction and you have nothing. And while indigenous peoples in Russia have everything they wish, it's just the fact that here in this region, indigenous peoples are actually free or more free or freer to talk about their challenges and what they face, including the historical injustices. And here, people do not belong to themselves. They cannot talk. They are either controlled by government or they are frightened to talk. So there is no, so they do not, or their relatives do not face consequences in future after the participation. And I personally face these consequences because I remember that 2 weeks after the annual report of the Permanent Forum was adopted, including by me, and there were many, not many, but several provisions criticizing Russia. In 2 weeks, I've seen a searches in my house, and the newspaper where my father is Crimean Tatar newspaper in the occupied Crimea. My father is chief editor, was also searched, and there were administrative fines. I do not think that my participation in the forum was the only reason, but I also think that it could serve several objectives, including sending a signal to me that I need to be more cautious when I work within the Permanent Forum.
Thank you. It's really important to hear and know. Yeah, I just wonder, Viliuia, maybe you want to react and reflect on what Suleiman have just spoken. And what do you think about it? Does it give you any hope for like more tools for self-advocacy, or I don't know, just your vision of further steps as an indigenous activist from Russia with all the risks and obstacles it brings to?
No, yeah, I think Suleiman sounds a bit more optimistic than me when saying that, yes, there's advancements in there is progress, but it's difficult for me to see it because in my advocacy, I use the United Nations more as a visibility platform. Like I don't hope for some practical changes or help. Like when I was there in Emry, under my video that was posted by Asians of Russia, there were comments like, why are you going there to beg for help? They're not going to help you. Like I'm not going there to beg for help. As I mentioned before, it's still important to bring alternative view on the current situation, alternative from the state. So that's what I use it for. But I mean, we have been talking a lot about the United Nations, but there's also regional institutions like Council of Europe, which I have more hopes for. For example, recently, Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe established a dialogue platform for the Russian democratic forces. I mean, that dialogue platform in itself, of course, I'm not that happy about because we wanted our own platform. But just the fact that it is something unprecedented and it has been established, it just motivates me that we can actually move these bureaucratic institutions in our favor. So we will continue advocating for our own platform within the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe. So, we use everything that we can to advocate for our rights and to be heard and to be visible. I also saw earlier that Selbi was raising her hand when I was speaking.
I wanted to ask you a question of if you know why you mentioned that your registration was rejected. Did they tell you why? And if you faced any pushback, because Suleiman talked a little bit about pushback, and if you faced any pushback when you participated too.
They don't tell why they reject the registration. So our registrations was rejected, not just mine, but also two other activists. So, I mean, we've discussed this with Suleiman as well before. Well, we think that it's Russian influence must have been involved. I mean, there is no other way, but we'll never know the truth. But I didn't really feel any pushback yet. I guess they don't really take me seriously because I've only been there once. So even though the representative of the Russian delegation did reply to my interventions, and he called us aggressive migrant organizations who do not represent anybody. So yeah, so I mean, I will be going there again. So I don't know if there will be some repercussions there. Of course, there's always a possibility, but perhaps they don't see me particularly as a threat yet. Maybe I've just been there once and then I will disappear somewhere, So yeah, we'll see. It remains to be seen.
Wow, it's very actually interesting how very often like colonial powers try to alienate indigenous people by calling them migrants or like, consciously or unconsciously, because this denial of actually any right to self-determination or belonging to the land that they actually occupy makes it very similar in a position like of a migrant, even though indigenous people came there before the colonizers. So I think it explains a lot, like, this how they actually called you.
Just to agree and say the words of like supporting that this is something that Russia uses a lot, try to delegitimize the voices of indigenous peoples who do not live in the territory of Russia or in the territory of Russia or other areas that it controls or occupies. I heard this not only towards, the peoples who live in the internationally recognized territory of Russia, but also within towards Crimean delegates. And what's interesting, Russia is like, I'm not sure, that Russia invented this mechanism, but they still think, many authoritarian regimes, I think, they believe that it's quite efficient for them. So first you create conditions that are unbearable, or you enforce repressive mechanisms and system of repressions against indigenous people or some group. They have to leave and find a refuge or asylum in other countries. And then you say that, they do not live in their countries. They have no link and connection with what they call their ancestral lands. And therefore, we think that, and look at our ideal government-controlled NGOs and individuals who are part of indigenous peoples. And what's interesting, I understand one thing, that the fact that a person, for example, who is a part of indigenous people, the fact that this person, he or she, becomes a part of a government-controlled NGO cannot deny, you cannot deny his or her identity as indigenous still. The fact that he or she is controlled and under influence, or either voluntarily or non-voluntarily, cannot deny the identity. And contrary to them, I never call them that they are non-indigenous or that they are far away from their people, which they do. They can tell that you're not indigenous, you do not live in your motherland for more than 10 years, and then it means that you cannot relate. They attacked the very core of your the sense of belonging and identity, and trying this way to delegitimize your voice. And I'm really glad that several times when they tried to do this with my statements within the permanent forum, there was a solidarity from other expert members who immediately started voicing their concerns and saying that Russia cannot act this way. Russian diplomats cannot undermine the legitimacy and cannot undermine the expertise of expert members of the forum this way. Yeah. At least with expert members, there is some level of protection. But I can just imagine how this can affect you when you hear these words and when you face these attacks from diplomats of really let's not deny it, powerful state. I remember before I became the expert member of the UNPFI, I participated in one of the sessions. And I remember that one of the representatives of the Russian delegation started video recording of my statement. And it was interesting to feel that more safe in Kiev under air attacks, under missile attacks, than than in New York, for example, when I did not feel the protection of, I don't know, of law enforcement agencies of the state to which I belong as a citizen. Yeah, even under air attacks, I felt more secure than outside of my country after making some very criticizing statements about the human rights situation in the occupied Crimea, for example.
But is there any chance, do you think, that these hierarchies within the, for example, United Nations and other international organizations can be shifted from, like, I don't know, these five, for example, powerful states who are in the Security Council and who are responsible for the most bloody wars and genocides, like in the past and present? I mean, or in any other way when, it just, is there any shift possible towards more like multiple?
To make the decision making based on a more multilateral approach. Selbi, maybe you can start with your vision, because I have a vision, but it's so negative.
I think it's a great question, and it was extremely interesting to listen about your experience of, if we can say, diplomacy of indigenous peoples in the UN. And I found it incredible, and I have many questions, and I would love to learn more. And I really, really wholeheartedly hope that you get great exposure and you get to write about it and you get to talk about it. If there's anything I can help, do approach me. And if you write anything, send it along. I would love to read it as well. There are, in terms of, if we think about UN, there has been a lot of criticism in that, and it's very difficult to make any change to the United Nations because of the nature of the charter. It's very difficult to change anything in the charter, and it's enshrined in the charter. For example, one of the bodies of the UN is Trusteeship Council, which was meant to initially, and it's again going back to the colonial question, it was meant to decide on how the colonial territories are being managed. And obviously now, formally, officially, we are in the post-colonial order, and I'm putting quotation marks. This body, it's like an atavism. It's there, but we don't need it. The reason why it's still there is because it's so difficult to make any changes to the UN Charter. So yes, and I share the pessimism in a way, and I think what is also important, and what this brings up, this whole discussion, is that colonialism is not the issue of the past. Coloniality is not the issue of the past. It's very much present in many structures. And I sort of have, and in terms of the UN Security Council, it has 15 members. 5 have the right of veto, and that's why it makes it so difficult to make any decision. And I've read there is this move to give greater space and more space to small states, or have, like, I think a little bit creatively of, I've read about the example of Monaco, which is a very, very small state, but it, for example, gave away some of its military. I'm not an expert on that. I'm just some trivia knowledge to give its military power to another state and exist in that way. And this could be an option. So how do we imagine our future within the existing system, but also with the outside of the system? And for me personally, I have I would say I have 2 feet, 2 ways of existing in that. One is I still work with the existent instruments. I still work with the master's tools because, as we've been mentioning, this is what we have. This is all what we have. And I was recently asked, "Oh, what about liberal democracies? What came after liberal democracies it's even worse. What about this post-liberal order?" And the answer to that is that the greatest enemy of liberal democracy and liberalism is not the left. It's not even the far right. It's liberalism itself. It's liberal democracies itself, because they don't play by their own rules. because of hypocrisy, because how do we talk about international law? How do we even, there was so much work to be done for it to be taken seriously, but after Gaza, after Palestine, how do we even raise that question? And again, liberals and those who are for this order, they cannot blame anyone but themselves. That's one strand of, yeah, we still work with the master's tool. We still work with the system, trying to advocate, even to follow your own rules. And there was a very interesting article back in the day when there was an invasion of Iraq, where they were saying that we spend all of our lives as international lawyers, as critical international lawyers, criticizing international law. But right now we kind of changed gears, and we are saying, please abide by international law, because it would have been so one step is just playing by the rules that are there. Another foot is being critical and seeing the flaws of the system, and also leaving space for imagining, leaving space for building solidarities, leaving space of imagining a different future. Yes, because hope is a habit. Hope is, I think it's one of the goals of liberalism is just to draw us into pessimism. But I do think that there are other ways to exist. And I think that's why there is so much in indigenous thinkers and indigenous ways of being we can learn from. Because and what also is important is that for indigenous peoples, the main form of resistance is existence, which again, just the fact that there is a really, I will finish with a quote from a book, The Red Deal, where they say that indigenous people, and this is on the role of the state, indigenous people, quote, indigenous people know that every moment of our existence is mediated by the state. It is fundamentally violent and reached in favor of murderous elites. We have no wish to reform or perfect it. But we refuse to relinquish the power of state institutions, the sheer resources available to humanity, to the ruling class, which I think is so powerful. They're saying we don't want to improve, but we will still use what is there. Yeah, and I'll end here.
When I was at the United Nations, there was also lots of talks that United Nations needs a reform. But my view on that is also quite pessimistic. It's going to take decades, if not longer, to reform. And yes, this veto right is very problematic. It needs to change, but how and when it will be, I have no idea. But I just agree that it needs to change.
Yeah, I see. I mean, I'm also pessimistic one in this area. But what actually was really that was missing in my understanding was this. Yeah, I think that in my questions I was very focused on this, like centralized, let's say, or like the major institutions of international law, with not putting needed attention towards regional platforms and coalitions. And I think maybe this is actually where we should look more. And me personally, I want to study and learn about this more. I was also thinking about, like, for example, I'm not sure if it's about this topic of international law, but in general, like in how we, for example, perceive regions. And I'm really glad to see how more and more often you can see that this, for example, regional subjectivity as North Asia and Central Asia, and they very often go hand in hand, like very close. So it's also about building solidarities across these national borders, right? It's about like reshaping the regions you wanted to be part of, or you can see the real connection with. And yeah, I will certainly learn more and think more about that.
Yeah, I think with regard to the possibilities or potential ways to reform the UN and the global order, I will start from some positive things. I think that even in the current situation, when it seems sometimes that the international law doesn't operate, and that we need to look at the purpose. I mean, international law, even today, can effectively regulate many things. Because it is not only about human rights, for example, it is not only about conflicts or global conflicts or regional conflicts. And yeah, it's about what's your objective. And I think I'm not sure that humanity can build any multilateral institution that would be ideal and that could and which will be able ideally address all the problems and challenges that we face or any other group can face, and that maybe sometimes we need to like filter and understand what can be resolved with the participation or inclusion of international law bodies, or not even international law, but UN bodies, and with the international law principles and norms, and what we can resolve without without the global arena, because many things like preservation of language, it can start from you. You can receive a lot of very powerful universal or recommendations. You can hear lessons learned from other regions, but still it's on you how you preserve your language. Either you talk with your family, with your I don't know, kids, or not. You learn it or not. It's on you, not on the United Nations. So yeah, when we criticize UN, we need to think about like what we can do at our level. But yes, at the same time, we need to just recognize and acknowledge it's very inefficient. And I think that it was the UN was criticized from the day of its establishment. I remember reading one of the books of the book of one of the secretary generals who served in 70s, and the content of criticism was quite the same that we hear today about UN. So yeah, on the one hand, still many issues can be resolved with the current order and system and international law. We just do not see it. I mean, or we do not pay attention. Many decisions and rulings of International Court of Justice were implemented. Many conventions were ratified and then incorporated into domestic law. But yeah, unfortunately, when it comes to indigenous peoples and decolonization, the progress is not so obvious. And with regard to your question, whether some comprehensive reshape is possible or rehaul of the system is possible, yeah, here I'm not so positive. And to be honest, I think there are two ways. The first way, humanity, in some magical way, will advance in its understanding of why the violence and violations are not needed, and why it is it is something that do not benefit us, and why it is, I'm sorry for this word, but too simple, maybe why it is bad. But I don't think that I believe that humanity will reach this kind of understanding in the nearest future. And the other way to make this whole is probably another global war. And maybe because I am based in Kiev, this is the view that I have, that only another global war. And here is the question, like, who will survive this war, given that this time it can be waged with nuclear weapons. On the second year of the full-scale invasion of Russia, one of the serious jokes that we had when we listened, when air siren alert started, was like, oh, just, I mean, with our guests from other countries, don't panic. We just need to check whether it's a nuclear or conventional weapon. Yeah, I think that the comprehensive change is possible, but what will be the price for it? I'm not sure. And maybe at some point, if humanity and the and the life on Earth will still be will still still exist. Maybe we'll reach this point when the decisions can be made on a more multilateral approach, or based on consensus. But something tells me that. So I have serious doubts if we can see this moment in the development of the whole humanity, of the entire humanity.
Thank you, Suleiman. I mean, yeah, it's understandable, because we could see in the past, in the history, that the world order would change only after wars that would lead then to the dissolution or reshaping the borders of the main, so to say, actors in the world politics. But I still do have hope that maybe in my lifetime I will see the dissolution of another one big country.
I'm for independence of the National Republic. So obviously, I do hope that I will get to see it in my lifetime. So yeah, but the notion that we need another big war for reforms to happen, it's very depressing. Yeah, of course, it's a little bit unmotivating to continue this. But I mean, yeah, as we have mentioned many times, all of us, that we have to work what we have and hope for the best.
I have to follow up on this topic. I have one last quote to build on. It's again from the Red Deal. It's from page 7. I'm quoting, land back strikes fear in the heart of the settler. But as we show here, it's the soundest environmental policy for a planet teetering on the brink of total ecological collapse. The path forward is simple. It's decolonization or extinction. And that starts with land back. End of quote.
Thank you. This is the perfect ending of this talk. Yeah, I think we're already in this global war. So, yeah, it is my big hope that it will lead to the dissolution of Russia and land back for all the indigenous people that it occupies. Thank you so much. It was so interesting and so enriching. And it was such a pleasure to listen to you, even though the topic is very hard. But all of your expertise and knowledge and your willingness to share, it's a big treasure. And thank you so much for that. You were listening to the Bur'yan podcast produced by Bida Media. Our guests were Suleiman Mamutov, Viliuia Choinova, and Selbi Durdiyeva. Moderating this episode was me, Lilia Yuldasheva. Thank you for listening. And if you like what we are doing, please support us by sharing our materials.